The early history of Siberia is greatly influenced by the sophisticated nomadic civilizations of the Scythians on the west of the Ural Mountains, and Xiongnu on the east of the Urals, both flourishing before the Christian era. The steppes of Siberia saw a succession of nomadic people, including the Khitan people, various Turkic peoples, and the Mongol Empire. In the late Middle Ages, Tibetan Buddhism spread into the areas south of Lake Baikal. A milestone in the history of the region was the arrival of the Russians in the 16th and 17th centuries, contemporaneous in many regards analogous to the European colonization of the Americas. During the Russian Empire, Siberia was an agricultural province and served as a place of exile, among others for Avvakum, Dostoevsky, and the Decembrists. The 19th century witnessed the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, industrialization and the discovery of vast reserves of Siberian mineral resources. Prehistory and Antiquity. According to the field of genetic genealogy, people first resided in Siberia by 45,000 BCE and spread out east and west to populate the Americas and Europe. According to Vasiliy Surikov, among the earliest inhabitants of central Siberia were the Yeniseians, who spoke a language different from the later Uralic and Turkic peoples. The Khets are considered the last remainder of this early migration. The shores of all Siberian lakes which filled the depressions during the lacustrine period abound in remains dating from the Neolithic age. Countless kurgans, furnaces, and other archaeological artifacts bear witness to a dense population. In fact, some of the earliest artifacts found in Central Asia derive from Siberia. The Yeniseians were followed by the Uralic Samoyedes, who came from the northern Ural region. Some traces of them, like the Selkup, remain in the Scythian region. They are credited with leaving behind the very numerous remains dating from the Bronze Age which are scattered all over southern Siberia. Iron was unknown to them, but they excelled in bronze, silver, and gold work. The bronze ornaments and implements are often polished, of inconsiderable artistic taste, and their irrigated fields covered wide areas in the fertile tracts. Indo-Iranian influences in southwestern Siberia can be dated as far back as the 2300–1000 BCE Andronovo culture. Between the 7th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Indo-Iranian Scythians flourished in the Altai region. They were a major influence on all later steppe empires. As early as the first millennium BCE, silk goods began turning up in Siberia, having traveled over the Silk Road. The establishment of the Xiongnu Empire in the 3rd century BCE started a series of population movements. Many peoples were probably driven to the northern borders of the Great Central Siberian Plateau. Turkic peoples like the Yenisei Kyrgyz had already been present in the Scythian region. Various Turkic tribes such as the Khakas and Ugur migrated northwestwards from the former seats and subdued the Ugric peoples. These new invaders likewise left numerous traces of the stay, and two different periods may be easily distinguished in the remains. They were acquainted with iron and learned from the subjects the art of bronze casting, which they used for decorative purposes only, and to which they gave a still higher artistic stamp. The pottery is more artistic and of a higher quality than that of the Bronze Age, and their ornaments are accounted included in the collections at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Middle Ages. Mongol conquest. The Mongols had long maintained relations with the peoples of the Siberian forest. They called them Oinerged. Many of them, such as the Baga and Uriankai, were little different from the Mongols. While the tribes around Lake Baikal were Mongol-speaking, those to the west spoke Turkic, Samoyedic, or Yeniseian languages. By 1206, Genghis Khan had conquered all Mongol and Turkic tribes in Mongolia and southern Siberia. In 1207, his eldest son Jochi subjugated subjugated the Siberian forest people, the Uryankai, the Oirats, Baga, Kharkis, Buryats, Tuvans, Kori-Tumed, and Kyrgyz. He then organized the Siberians into three tumans. Genghis Khan gave the Telengat and Tolas along the Irtysh River to an old companion, Korchi, while the Baga, Tumed, Buryats, Kori, Kashmiti, and Bashkirs were organized in separate thousands. The Telengat, Tolas, Oirats and Yenisei Kyrgyz were numbered as tumans. Genghis settled a colony of Chinese craftsmen and farmers at Kemkemchik after the first phase of the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty. The great Khans favored gerfalcons, furs, women and Kyrgyz horses for tribute. Western Siberia came under the Golden Horde. The descendants of Ordar Khan, the eldest son of Jochi, directly ruled the area. In the swamps of western Siberia, dog-sled yam stations were set up to facilitate collection of tribute. In 1270, Kublai Khan sent a Chinese official with a new batch of colonists to serve as judge of the Kyrgyz and Tuvan basin areas. Oged's grandson Kaidu occupied portions of central Siberia from 1275 on. The Yuan dynasty army under Kublai's Kipchak general Tutu reoccupied the Kyrgyz lands in 1293. From then on, the Yuan dynasty controlled large portions of central and eastern Siberia, Novgorod and Muscovy. As early as the 11th century, the Novgorodians had occasionally penetrated into Siberia. In the 14th century, the Novgorodians explored the Kara Sea and the West Siberian River Ob. After the fall of the Novgorod Republic, its communications between northern Russia and Siberia were inherited by the Grand Duchy of Moscow. On May 9, 1483, the Moscow troops of Princes Fyodor Kurbsky-Cherny and Ivan Saltykov moved to West Siberia. The troops moved on the rivers Tavda, Tura, Irtysh up to the River Ob. In 1499, Muscovites and Novgorodians skied to West Siberia up to the River Ob and subdued some local tribes. Khanate of Siberia. With the breakup of the Golden Horde late in the 14th century, the Khanate of Siberia was founded with its center at Tyumen. The non-Borjigin Taibafid dynasty vied for rule with the descendants of Sheban, son of Jochi. In the beginning of the 16th century, Tatar fugitives from Turkestan subdued the loosely associated tribes inhabiting the lowlands to the east of the Ural Mountains. Agriculturists, tanners, merchants, and mullahs were brought from Turkestan, and small principalities sprang up on the Irtysh and the Ob. These were united by Khan Yadega Mohammad of Kazan. Conflicts with the Russians, who were then colonizing the Urals, brought him into collision with Muscovy. Khan Yadega's envoys came to Moscow in 1555 and consented to a yearly tribute of 1,000 sables. Yermak and the Cossacks. In the mid-16th century, the Tsardom of Russia conquered the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, thus annexing the entire Volga region and making the way to the Ural Mountains open. The colonization of the new easternmost lands of Russia and further onslaught eastward was led by the rich merchant Stroganov's Tsar Ivan IV, granted large estates near the Urals as well as tax privileges to Aniki Stroganov, who organized large-scale migration to these lands. Stroganovs developed farming, hunting, saltworks, fishing, and ore mining on the Urals and established trade with Siberian tribes. In the 1570s, the entrepreneur Semyon Stroganov and other sons of Aniki Stroganov enlisted many Cossacks for protection of the Ural settlements against attacks by the Tatars of the Siberian Khanate, led by Khan Kuchum. Stroganov suggested to the chief Yermak, hired in 1577 to conquer the Khanate of Siberia, promising to help him with supplies of food and arms. In 1581 Yermak began his voyage into the depths of Siberia with a band of 1,636 men, following the Tagil and Tura rivers. The following year they were on the Tobol, and 500 men successfully laid siege to Kashlik, the residence of Khan Kachik near what is now Tobolsk. After a few victories over the Khan's army, Yermak's people defeated the main forces of Kachim on Irtysh River after a three-day battle of Chavash Cape in 1582. The remains of the Khan's army retreated to the steppes, abandoning his domains to Yermak, who, according to tradition, by presenting Siberia to Tsar Ivan IV, achieved his own restoration to favor. Kachim still was strong and suddenly attacked Yermak in 1585 in the dead of night, killing most of his people. Yermak was wounded and tried to swim across the Wagay River, but drowned under the weight of his own chainmail. Yermak's Cossacks had to withdraw from Siberia completely, but every year new bands of hunters and adventurers, supported by Moscow, poured into the country. Thanks to Yermak's having explored all the main river routes in West Siberia, Russians successfully reclaimed all Yermak's conquests just several years later. Russian exploration and settlement. In the early 17th century, the eastward movement of Russian people was slowed by the internal problems in the country during the time of troubles. However, very soon the exploration and colonization of the huge territories of Siberia was resumed, led mostly by Cossacks hunting for valuable furs and ivory. While Cossacks came from the southern Urals, another wave of Russian people came by the Arctic Ocean. These were Pomors from the Russian north, who already had been making fur trade with Mongols in the north of the western Siberia for quite a long time. In 1607 the settlement of Turkansk was founded on the northern Yenisei River, near the mouth of the lower Tunguska, and in 1619 Yeniseiski Ostrog was founded on the mid-Yenisei at the mouth of the upper Tunguska. In 1620 a group of fur hunters led by the semi-legendary Demid Pianda started out from Turkansk on what would become a very protracted journey, according to folk tales related a century after the fact. In the 3.5 years from 1620 to 1624, Pianda allegedly traversed the total of 4,950 miles of hitherto unknown large Siberian rivers. He explored some 1,430 miles of the lower Tunguska, and, having reached the upper part of the Tunguska, he came upon the Great Siberian River Lena and explored some 1,500 miles of its length. By doing this, he may have become the first Russian to reach Yakutia and meet Yakuts. He returned up the Lena until it became too rocky and shallow, and by land reached Angara. In this way, Pianda may have become the first Russian to meet Buryats. He built new boats and explored some 870 miles of the Angara, finally reaching Yeniseisk and discovering that the Angara and Upper Tunguska were one and the same river. In 1627 Pyotr Baikatov was appointed a Nizhny voivoda in Siberia. He successfully carried out the voyage to collect taxes from Zabaikali Buryats, becoming the first Russian to enter Buryatia. There he founded the first Russian settlement, Rybinsky Ostrog. Baikatov was sent to the Lena River in 1631, where in 1632 he founded Yakutsk and sent his Cossacks to explore the Aldan and further down the Lena, to found new fortresses and to collect taxes. Yakutsk soon turned into a major base for further Russian expeditions eastward, southward and northward. Maxim Pofilyev, who earlier had been one of the founders of Yeniseisk, founded Bratsky Ostrog in 1631, and in 1638 he became the first Russian to enter Transbaikalia. In 1639 a group led by Ivan Moskvitin became the first Russian to reach the Pacific Ocean and to discover the Sea of Okhotsk, having built a winter camp on its shore at the Aldia River mouth. The Cossacks learned from the locals about the proximity of the Amur River. In 1640 they apparently sailed south, explored the southeastern shores of the Okhotsk Sea, maybe even reaching the mouth of the Amur River and discovering the Shantar Islands on the return voyage. Based on Moskvitin's account, Kubat Ivanov drew the first Russian map of the Far East in 1642. He led a group of Cossacks himself in 1643 to the south of the Baikal Mountains, and discovered Lake Baikal, visiting its Solkhorn Island. Subsequently Ivanov made the first chart and description of Baikal. In 1643, Vasiliy Surikov crossed the Stanovoy Range and reached the upper Zaya River in the country of the Dors, who were paying tribute to Manchu Chinese. After wintering in 1644, Surikov pushed down the Zaya and became the first Russian to reach the Amur River. He sailed down the Amur and finally discovered the mouth of that great river from land. Since his Cossacks provoked the enmity of the locals behind, Surikov chose a different way back. They built boats and in 1645 sailed along the Sea of Okhotsk coast to the Aldia River and spent the next winter in the huts that had been built by Ivan Moskvitin 6 years earlier. In 1646 they returned to Yakutsk. In 1644 Mikhail Stadukin discovered the Kolyma River and founded Srednyokolimsk. A merchant named Fedor Alexeyev Popov organized a further expedition eastward, and Dezhnyov became captain of one of the Kochi. In 1648 they sailed from Srednyokolimsk down to the Arctic, and after some time they rounded Cape Dezhnyov, thus becoming the first explorers to pass through Bering Strait and to discover Chukotka and the Bering Sea. All at Kochi and most of the men were lost in storms and clashes with the natives. A small group led by Dezhnyov reached the mouth of the Anadyr River and sailed up it in 1649, having built new boats out of the wreckage. They founded Anadyrsk and were stranded there until Stadukin found them, coming from Kolyma by land. Later Stadukin set off to the south in 1651 and discovered Penjin Bay on the northern side of the Okhotsk Sea. He also may have explored the western shores of Kamchatka as early as the 1650s. In 1649–50 Yerofey Khabarov became the second Russian to explore the Amur River. Through the Olyokma, Tunga and Shilka rivers he reached the Amur, returned to Yakutsk and then went back to the Amur with a larger force in 1650–53. This time he was met with armed resistance. He built winter quarters at Albazan, then sailed down the Amur and found Oshonsk, which preceded the present-day Khabarovsk, defeating or evading large armies of Dorian Manchu Chinese and Koreans on his way. He charted the Amur in his draft of the Amur River. In 1659–65 Kubat Ivanov was the next head of Anadyrsky Ostrog after Semyon Dezhnyov. In 1660 he sailed from Anadyr Bay to Cape Dezhnyov. Atop his earlier pioneering charts, he is credited with creation of the early map of Chukotka and Bering Strait, which was the first to show on paper the yet undiscovered Wrangel Island, both Diomede Islands and Alaska. So, by the mid-17th century the Russian people had established the borders of the country close to the modern ones, and explored almost the whole of Siberia, except eastern Kamchatka and some regions north of the Arctic Circle. The conquest of Kamchatka would be completed later, in the early 18th century by Vladimir Atlasov, while the discovery of the Arctic coastline and Alaska would be nearly completed by the Great Northern Expedition in 1733 to 1743. The expedition allowed cartographers to create a map of most of the northern coastline of Russia, thanks to the results brought by a series of voyages led by Fyodor Minin, Dmitry Ovsin, Vasily Pronkishchev, Semyon Chelyuskin, Dmitry Laptev and Khariton Laptev. At the same time, some of the members of the newly founded Russian Academy of Sciences traveled extensively through Siberia, forming the so-called academic squad of the expedition. They were Johann Georg Gmelin, Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt and others, who became the first scientific explorers of Siberia. Russian people and Siberian natives. The main treasure to attract Cossacks to Siberia was the fur of sables, foxes, and ermines. Explorers brought back many furs from their expeditions. Local people, submitting to the Russian Empire, received defense from the southern nomads. In exchange they were obliged to pay yasik in the form of furs. There was a set of Yasachny roads, used to transport yasik to Moscow. A number of peoples showed open resistance to Russian people. Others submitted and even requested to be subordinated, though sometimes they later refused to pay yasik, or not admitted to the Russian authority. There is evidence of collaboration and assimilation of Russian people with the local peoples in Siberia. Though the more Russian people advanced to the east, the less developed the local people were, and the more resistance they offered. In 1607 to 1610, the Tungus fought strenuously for their independence, but were subdued around 1623. The Buryats also offered some opposition, but were swiftly pacified. The most resistance was offered by the Koryuk and Chukchi, the latter still being at the Stone Age level of development. Resistance by local people may have been the result of forced unfair terms that imperial recorders would have benefited from omitting. The Manchu resistance, however, obliged the Russian Cossacks to quit Albazin, and by the Treaty of Nerchinsk Russia abandoned her advance into the basin of the river, instead concentrating on the colonization of the vast expanses of Siberia and trading with China via the Siberian Tract. In 1852 a Russian military expedition under Nikolai Muravyov explored the Amur, and by 1857 a chain of Russian Cossacks and peasants were settled along the whole course of the river. The accomplished fact was recognized by China in 1860 by the Treaty of Agun. Scientists in Siberia. The scientific exploration of Siberia commenced in the period of 1720 to 1742 by Daniel Gottlieb Messerschmitt, Johann Georg Gmelin, and Louis de Lisle de la Croix. It was followed up by Gerhard Friedrich Müller, Johann Eberhard Fischer, and Johann Gottlieb Georgi. Peter Simon Pallas, with several Russian students, laid the first foundation of a thorough exploration of the topography, fauna, flora, and inhabitants of the country. The journeys of Christopher Hanstein and Georg Adolf Oman were the most important step in the exploration of the territory. Alexander von Humboldt, Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg, and Gustav Rose also paid short visits to Siberia, which gave a new impulse to the accumulation of scientific knowledge, while Karl Ritter elaborated in his Asien the foundations of a sound knowledge of the structure of Siberia. Alexander Fyodorovich Middendorf's journey to northeastern Siberia, contemporaneous with Matthias Castrain's journeys for the special study of the Ural Altaic languages, directed attention to the far north and awakened interest in the Amur, the basin of which soon became the scene of the expeditions of Vactor and Schwartz, and later on of the Siberian expedition. Advanced knowledge of East Siberia. The Siberian branch of the Russian Geographical Society was founded at the same time in Irkutsk, and afterwards became a permanent center for the exploration of Siberia, while the opening of the Amur and Sakhalin attracted Richard Mayk, Schmidt Glenn, Gustav Rad, and Leopold von Schrenck, who created works on the flora, fauna, and inhabitants of Siberia. Russian settlement in the 17th and 18th centuries. The Russian people that migrated into Siberia were hunters, and those who had escaped from central Russia, fugitive peasants in search for life free of serfdom, fugitive convicts, and old believers. The new settlements of Russian people and the existing local peoples required defense from nomads, for which forts were founded. This way forts of Tomsk and Bursk were founded. In the beginning of the 18th century, the threat of the nomads' attacks weakened, thus the region became more and more populated. Normal civic life was established in the cities. In the 18th century in Siberia, a new administrative gubernia was formed with Irkutsk. Then in the 19th century the territory was several times redivided with creation of new gubernias, Tomsk and Yenisei. In the 1730, the first large industrial project, the metallurgical production found by Demidov family, gave birth to the city of Ural. Later, the enterprise organized social institutions like library, club, theater. Pyotr Semenov Tyanshansky, who stayed in Ural in 1856 to 1857, wrote, "The richness of mining engineers of Ural expressed not merely in the households and clothes, but more in their educational level, knowledge of science and literature." Ural was undoubtedly the most cultured place in Siberia, and I've called it Siberian Athens. Leaving Sparta for Omsk, the same events took place in other cities. Public libraries, museums of local law, colleges, theaters were being built. Although the first university in Siberia was opened as late as 1880 in Tomsk, Siberian peasants more than those in European Russia relied on their own force and abilities. They had to fight against the harder climate without outside help. Lack of serfdom and landlords also contributed to their independent character. Unlike peasants in European Russia, Siberians had no problems with land availability. The low population density gave them the ability to intensively cultivate a plot for several years in a row, then to leave it fallow for a long time and cultivate other plots. Siberian peasants had an abundance of food, while Central Russian peasantry had to moderate the family's appetites. Leonid Blummer noted that the culture of alcohol consumption differed significantly. Siberian peasants drank frequently but moderately. For a Siberian, vodka isn't a wonder, unlike for a Russian peasant, which, having reached it after all this time, is ready to drink a sea. The houses, according to the traveler's notes, were unlike the typical Russian izbas. The houses were big, often two-floored, the ceilings were high, the walls were covered with boards and painted with oil paint.